Hello, and welcome to our presentation on quantitative research methodologies, specifically correlations. This study is by Ashley Sagala, Janie Noble, Jatura Nima, Rakima Thomas-Toussaint, and Rayla Rideau. Before we start, do you know what a correlational study is? In a correlational study, which is a quantitative research method, the researcher looks for relationships between two or more quantitative variables in order to relate the variables and predict outcomes. Researchers are not able to control or manipulate variables in a correlational study. Before we go any further, we have to cover the different types of data. As you may know, there are qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data mostly refers to words or descriptions, whereas quantitative data is mostly referred to as numbers or numerical types of data. There are four different data categories. First, we have nominal data, which are categories such as race and religion. Next, we have ordinal data, which are data that can be ranked, such as first, second, or third. And last, we have interval and ratio data, which are numbers such as temperature or weight. More specifically, interval data can go below zero. For example, temperature can be in the negative degrees. Ratio data has an absolute zero. For instance, you cannot weigh less than 0 pounds. Both interval and ratio data are used in correlational studies. In quantitative research, the researcher is looking to either describe, compare, or analyze relationships between variables. In a correlational study, there must be at least one dependent and one independent variable. In studies with more than one independent variable, these are called multivariate. Other studies are called bivariate if there's just one independent variable. In a correlational study, the researcher uses the Pearson product moment correlation, R value, to determine the amount of association between two variables. The R values range from -1 to +1, with 0 meaning no correlation at all. Some researchers choose to show their scatter plots in their studies. Others only show their data and statistical output. In the example shown here, circled in red, we see 0.985, which is the correlation coefficient for this study. This is a strong positive correlation. Whoa, this is all amazing, but where did the idea of correlation even come from? According to a 1988 study by Rogers and Niswander, the origin of correlation statistics can be dated back to the year 1823. The most prominent leaders in correlation statistics are Galton and Pearson. Pearson most known for the Pearson product moment correlation. In the early 1800s, Sir Francis Galton added to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He's responsible for R measuring correlation. Later on in the same century, Carl Pearson created a formula for calculating correlation. Up to this point, we've talked about what correlation is. We've talked about the history of correlational studies. Now let's go over some defining features. Remember that correlation studies, they only measure the association between two quantitative variables. They cannot measure causation, and they are used to make predictions. If one does not have the means to either calculate the correlation coefficient or use a statistical program to do so, then a scatter plot is a good way to show if two quantitative variables are correlated or not. Scatter plots are great tools to see the relationships between two quantitative variables, such as in a bivariate study. However, in a multivariate study, when there are more than one independent variables, the correlation matrix is the best tool to see the relationships between each of the variables. Here we have an example of a correlation matrix. If you look at row 4, column 2, we can see that the strongest correlation is between extracurricular activities and self-esteem at positive 0.65. The two asterisks let us know that this result is statistically significant. By now, we have covered quite a lot of information on correlational studies. Now let's take a look at how we collect data for these studies. In correlational studies, one can use several different forms of data collection methods. Here are a few examples: public and private records, surveys, questionnaires, content analysis, and naturalistic observations. Remember, each of these must be statistically measurable. According to Spickard, 2016, public and private records are those maintained by governments, businesses, nonprofit organizations, and other entities. Surveys are a set of questions used to collect people's reports of their acts or behaviors. Questionnaires are the set of questions that can be used on a survey. Content analysis is the examination of text, films, events, and other items to count the occurrences of events. And naturalistic observations are recording real-time behaviors and patterns. Now, using all of the information that we've just learned about correlational studies, we're going to critique an article of our own. For our critique, we've chosen an article by Julie Shape, Early Childhood Assessment, a correlational study of the relationships among student performance, student feelings, and teacher perceptions. According to Shape, current preschool assessments lack the ability to capture performance variance and complex thinking skills. This study examined the relationship among student performance, student feelings, and teacher perceptions as they apply to using a formal performance assessment in the preschool setting. A formal performance assessment was administered to 71 preschool-aged children. The data were analyzed using descriptive and inferential statistics. As hypothesized, there was a significant and positive correlation between the student's performance and the teacher's perceptions. Furthermore, there was not a significant relationship between either the student's feelings and the teacher's perceptions, or the student's feelings and the student's performance. These findings in theoretical study indicate support for the use of formal performance assessment to evaluate preschool students. Although the abstract is a nice summary of the article, we'd like to include some of our own thoughts and critiques about the article. In the introduction of the article, Shape mentioned several resources such as the National Research Council Committee on Early Childhood Pedagogy and National Association for the Education of Young Children that state that instructional and assessment practices do not currently address the needs of preschool children. Shape mentions on page 188 of the article that main difficulties surrounding observation of students are inconsistencies in teachers' decisions involving what to observe, how to record observations, and how to make inferences. With the previous inconsistencies that have been mentioned, this study seeks to address this shortcoming in assessment practices by advocating the use of formal performance assessments with preschool students. According to the literature review, assessments are imperative for both students and teachers. For students, the appropriate assessments encourage students to be engaged in the learning process, and for teachers, the appropriate assessments help them know how to best support students socially and cognitively. This image illustrates the theoretical framework used in this study. Here we have 3 different hypotheses that will be tested. The first is that there will be a significant and positive relationship between the student's demonstrated performance and the teacher's perceptions of overall student achievement. Hypothesis 2 states there will not be a significant relationship between the student's feelings about the assessment activities and the student's performance on the assessment. Hypothesis 3 states there will not be a significant relationship between the student's feelings about the assessment activities and the teacher's perceptions of overall student achievement. For this study, the researchers started with 71 students, 41 male and 30 female students, all Caucasian, preschool-age students from 4 to 6 years old, and ranging from 4 different classrooms at one school. It is important to note that for this study, the researcher used a convenient sample to collect the participants. All of the students are Caucasian and attend the same school. Due to the lack of diversity among the students, it may be difficult to generalize any findings from this study. To collect the data from this study, the researcher used 3 different tools. 1, the teacher perception survey, 2, the performance assessment rubric, and 3, the student affective assessment. The Teacher Perception Survey consisted of 25 items of skills and behaviors that teachers were asked to provide the frequency of. Teachers were asked to range their responses from 1 to 5, 1 representing never occurring to 5 always occurring. Due to the use of a Likert-type scale, the researcher should clarify the use of numbers in place of words. Remember that in correlational studies, the researcher must use interval or ratio data. Here, numbers represent words, which may confuse the reader. The performance assessment rubric was used by the researcher with each of the students to build a neighborhood as a task. It examined communication, self-confidence, organization, and content. Students receiving a score of 1 meant they needed support to complete the task. Students receiving a score of 4 meant they could complete the task independently. The researcher conducted the study by herself with each of the students to eliminate the possibility of inter-rater reliability. The student affective assessment measures students' feelings regarding looking outside, reading, art, and building. Students were asked to complete a survey circling one of the smiley faces that corresponded to how they felt. In the article, the researcher does not clearly disclose how the data from the student affective assessment was calculated or quantified for the study. The first step in this procedure is to have teachers complete the teacher perception survey, seal them in an envelope, and deliver them to the researcher. Next, the researcher administers the performance assessment rubric with each of the students individually. Last, the students complete the student affective self-assessment administered by the researcher. Once all of the data has been collected, it's now time to conduct a data analysis. The researcher uses both descriptive and inferential statistics. In this study, for descriptive statistics, the researcher uses the mean and standard deviation to determine the variation among scores. Examples of inferential statistics include correlation, ANOVA, and post hoc test. The chi-square test is used as well. Since this is a correlational study, the main goal is to determine the measure of association or relationship among variables. All other inferential statistics are used to verify findings and counter any threats to validity. Based on this correlation matrix of the results from our study, we can see that each of the 3 hypotheses previously mentioned are all supported. If you recall, Hypothesis 1 stated that there will be a significant and positive relationship between the student's demonstrated performance and the teacher's perceptions of overall student achievement. As can be seen in our correlation matrix, this information can be seen in row 1, column 2, with a positive 0.35 correlation. The asterisks also indicate that our result is statistically significant. As we can see with our other two results, 0.08 and 0.02, both hypothesis 2 and 3 are both supported because there is not a significant relationship between either of these constructs. Using ANOVA, the researcher can determine if there are any differences among classes for the teacher perception survey. Using the results, we see that the SIG value of 0.03 indicates that there are a difference between at least 2 of the classes. Using a post hoc test, a researcher can determine exactly which classes differ. Using the Chaffee post hoc test, we can see that there is a statistically significant difference between classes 1 and 4 as indicated by the purple arrow. Several pros and cons were associated with this study. For instance, 83% of the original participants were able to complete the study. Also, the researcher clearly defined which tests were chosen for the study and why. The researcher also included several clear depictions of its data. Several issues were found with the study as well. For instance, the researcher did not present the results near a research question. The researcher also did not include any scatterplot visuals, especially since this is a correlational study. And last, not all data was presented in the study for the reader. In addition to the researcher's findings, there were several limitations to this study, all of which were discussed in the article and in our critique, which can be found following this presentation. We thank you in advance for listening, and please provide feedback. Thank you again.